Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me along. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I say the slides will go on screen shortly, but I was very glad when Stephanie introduced the event as being one in which we were all experts and not experts at the same time, because I've got to start with a disclaimer that I am not a psychologist. I know much less about there we are, you can see the slides now. I know very little about your specialist field, but I guess that's why I've been asked to come along, because what I am doing today then is I am giving you that bigger picture about how psychology fits into this broader quest that we have in Scotland. Oh, excuse me just now, many apologies, to tackle poverty in Scotland. Can I just confirm that everybody can see those slides? If somebody could just shout back to me.
Yeah, we can see them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate that. So I'm going to try and cover a lot, but I'm also going to try and leave some time for questions towards the end, and I'd be really, really glad to engage in some dialogue, so it's a meeting of minds towards the end of the presentation. But I say I'm going to try and give you the big picture to enable us to think about where educational psychology fits into this bigger agenda in Scotland about tackling poverty. That disclaimer at the start, this is Manuel, for those of a certain age who professed to know nothing. And as I say, I know very little about psychology, but what I do know is about tackling poverty in Scotland and the broader role of education within that. So I very much hope that meeting of minds is exactly what we're needing to start off the conference. I think it's always useful, I think, to understand where people are coming from, and just some background to myself so that you can position my thinking against my biography and background. For the first few years of my life, I grew up in the East End of Glasgow, in Tollcross. Some of you may be familiar with that part of the city. Some of you may be familiar with the maps that I'm going to show over the next few slides, which are the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. I won't get too geeky on you, although I am a geographer, but the darker the red, the more we understand that place to be deprived. So according to the SIMD, where I started my life was one of the very most deprived areas in Scotland. And apparently I moved to another one of the very most deprived areas in Scotland, part of the Newtown exodus of Glasgow. My family moved to Kilwinning in Irvine Newtown, and I grew up in the estate in Pennyburn. But I think it's worth pausing and noting about good times, because my experience in education is very positive. Pennyburn Primary School and Kilwinning Academy were the two institutions that I spent my time in. There were some dull moments. I can remember being pinned to a wall by a history teacher for being a little bit cheeky, arriving late at class one day. I can remember a stream of senior staff running into the car park because we had pushed a car aside. We had literally pushed a car aside to create space for ourselves to play five-a-sides at a lunchtime. But again, other than these little aberrations, I think my experiences of education were very good. There was a little bit of bullying along the way. I can remember in first year being a little bit scared to go to science because I was getting picked on by a girl in the class, and it physically made me feel sick from time to time. But as I say, my bigger picture in education was one that served me well. Good teachers, good schools, good friends, and allowed me to set myself up for life and what followed. What followed first, though, was a move to Stevenston. I became a parent at a young age while I was at university in my third year, and I moved into an estate in the north of Stevenston. I then moved to Manchester, and then after Manchester, 4 years in Manchester, came back up to Glasgow and moved to Troon. The estate I stayed in Troon then was not red. This time it was blue. It was one of the more affluent parts of the country, although my two children were split between two very different schools at the time. And, you know, interesting perspectives and equity there. My son was at nursery school, which was in a school that served a poorer part of Troon and Muirhead, and my daughter was in the neighbourhood school at a primary school. And I can always remember the school fetes and the difference in prizes in those school fetes. I'm literally not exaggerating, but one year I actually won the top prize in the Christmas draw, which was a big box of chocolates in my son's school in Muirhead. I was very close, but didn't quite win the main prize in the summer fete in my daughter's school, serving the more affluent area, which was to get the free access to a sports car for an afternoon. And that to me is very striking, because there are these incredible inequities in school environments. Both were doing good work, both committed, both good environments, both environments in which my children thrived, but the resources that were available to those schools, the resources that parents could bring and layer to the resources already in schools were quite dramatically unequal. I currently live in North Lanarkshire, and once again I find myself in one of Scotland's 10% most deprived areas, but absolutely not poor and impoverished or deprived by any stretch of the imagination. So the reason for this biography, and this is my educational biography, currently at Glasgow Caledonian, but moved through different universities to get there. Some red brick, a new university such as the one I'm in just now in Strathclyde to start off. The reason for that biography then is to understand why I maybe think the way that I do. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are a whole range of perceptions of what poverty is. What we think is not necessarily what our colleagues think, and is not necessarily what our wider communities think about poverty. And this, if you like, is the range of perspectives that we can take. Some of us just simply won't see poverty to be a problem. We will perhaps see it as inevitable, unproblematic, something that's always there, something that always will be there. But I think the majority of us understand that poverty is a problem. But again, the nature of that problem is viewed very, very differently by different populations, and we have polar opposite positions to consider. There are some who will view poor people as the architect of their own problems, blaming poor people for making bad decisions, and the circumstances in which they find themselves are entirely their own fault. At the other end of that spectrum, there are those that blame hidden hands, the way the economy works, decisions that are made by elites that keep people poor. Two very, very different views about what poverty is, but both of which see poverty as a problem. Now, my own perspective is very much in the middle, and that our anti-poverty interventions haven't been effective enough. And I tend to view this as the vision of the optimist, because I truly believe that poverty is not inevitable. I don't think that the numbers that are experiencing poverty in Scotland at the current time suggest that there are lots of poor people making bad decisions. But I also don't think that it's just down to elites keeping people poor. I think we have resources at our disposal, educational psychology and education being among them, that if used more effectively could tackle the problems of poverty and the problems that present as a result. I kind of think these things about poverty, it's a waste. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of opportunity. It is not good for business. I think there is a lot of evidence that suggests that, rather than a P&O style intervention of the last few days where we drive down costs by keeping wages low, I think we do understand that that's not good business sense, and that in a balanced society that works for all, keeping wages low is, as I say, is not the way to have a prosperous economy. It is a condition that some people choose, but it's not the usual suspects. Franciscan monks are the group that I understand choose a vow of poverty. But I think there is wide misunderstanding in society that there are many people that are choosing not to work. There are many people that are living in a life on the edge of poverty as a result of not wanting to engage in the labour market and decisions that they are making. And really, the evidence just doesn't add up when we look at that in greater detail. Poverty can also mean many different things in children, and I think this is useful for us to acknowledge as well. Some have argued that poverty is actually a good thing for children. This man, for example, Lewis Hamilton, I've got a long memory, I've not let this one go. When Lewis Hamilton was nominated for the BBC Sports Personality of the Year back in 2018, he made reference to growing up in the Stevenage slums. Actual word that he used in his introduction, and accounted for growing up in the Stevenage slums for giving him the drive to make him the success that he later became. An undoubted success, and in many ways a fine ambassador for many good things in society. However, his view of his childhood is not one that quite matches reality, and one that the good people of Stevenage were inflamed at the comment that somehow they grew up in slums. But the point remains, and it remains, I think, something that sits in the background, particularly with regard to professional sport, that poverty is not necessarily a bad thing. Poverty makes you hungry. Poverty makes you want to succeed. Poverty actually can be a driver for later success. I think these perceptions or tropes about poverty are also important for us to consider when we're trying to fashion responses at the current time. But beyond that, there are a whole gamut of ways in which poverty may or may not impact in children. It might not have an impact, not necessarily a positive impact, but it might have no impact. And I would argue that that's actually quite a good thing, that if poverty exists in the family that perhaps we can't do anything about, but it's not having an impact in the child, then that suggests to me that our framework of social support, what we do in education, what we do in community work, is ameliorating the impact of that family poverty and is ensuring that children are, at the very least, little affected by the poverty that presents in the family. So the fact that children are not negatively impacted by poverty, or at least some children are not negatively impacted by poverty, is, in my opinion, a view of a society that's working well. A society then that's using its collective resources to promote, to support its most vulnerable. But unfortunately, more commonly, the reality is that poverty's got a hidden impact, and that will become more apparent, or won't become more apparent rather, over the course of 2022 when the cost of living crisis kicks into families across the nation. What inevitably will happen is parents will bear the burden of that cost of living squeeze and will do whatever they can to protect their children and to ensure their children don't go without. The cost, if you like, will be felt by many parents, and doing the very best they can in many ways to prevent their children from experiencing negative outcomes. But negative outcomes do result. They result in the here and now for children and lives as lived, and they have longer term consequences of children's futures as well. So I'm certainly not presenting a positive let's not worry about poverty view, but I think it's important that we understand the complexity of ways in which poverty is rationalised and understood in wider society, and the complexity of it. But I did mention that, there are things that have been done, there are concerns to tackle poverty, and there are literally two giants out there. They're not fighting each other, these giants, and I think they might be cuddling each other in the years going ahead. Because these two poverty giants in terms of poverty in Scotland are our Child Poverty Delivery Plan, and the second iteration of that was released literally yesterday. And specifically in education, of course, the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which the refreshed version will be released next week. So it's a really of the moment time to be speaking about these issues. But they are really two giants that are trying to redefine what Scotland is. The Child Poverty Act of 2017 committed Scotland to eradicate child poverty by 2030. And the delivery plan challenges national government, local government and actors within, as well as implications for health sector and third sector, to contribute towards that national effort of eradicating poverty. And of course, as you will be familiar with within the realm of education, narrowing that poverty-related attainment gap as part of that Scottish Attainment Challenge is something that has taxed education for the last few years, and hopefully a reinvigorated approach will follow with SAC version 2 is released next week. The end game for that 2017 Act, and here it's articulated in terms of four quantitative indicators, is to eradicate child poverty. And we measure that by way of household income. When I'm talking about poverty in terms of the national ambition, what we're referring to is living in households whose resources are so far below a typical income that that household can't fully participate in society. And we use household income to measure that. It's a different metric, of course, that we use in education, where the Scottish Attainment Challenge is defined differently, sometimes using a Scottish Index of Multi-Deprivation categories, at other times using free school meals as an indicative metric, and certainly a means to allocate resources. Oh, excuse me, sorry. That's really... Sorry about that. I hope I'm not going to get pestered by calls. I've got my phone in the other room and there's not much I can do about that at the current time. Anyway, these are the indicators. This is what we're working to. This is what Scotland would look like if we managed to eradicate that child poverty. But what do we think about poverty? Now, we are educational psychologists or associated practitioners. We may have a particular contribution to make. We may have a certain point of engagement with poverty that maybe leads us to experience it in a particular way. I think it's always very useful to step out of our own professional areas and think more broadly about what the nation thinks. And we have resources that enable us to do this. The British Social Attitude Survey enables us to find out what different populations across Britain think about a whole manner of social issues. And sometimes they ask questions about poverty. This is the images that tends to spring to our head. We tend to associate, or traditionally have associated, poverty with somebody making bad decisions, and a kind of man of later years infused with alcohol is perhaps the image that encapsulate that the best. This morning, I typed in the words child poverty in Scotland into Google Images, and these were the images that it threw up at the top. The algorithm created as the most significant. And while they are horrific images to look at, they very much don't represent the face of poverty in Scotland at the current time. But this is the kind of mindset that we have, that poverty is extreme deprivation. It is on the margins of existence, whereas the reality is that poverty is much more widespread and much more pernicious. The extent to which children can't fully participate undoubtedly relates to the images in front of us, but it relates to far more children than that as well. And I think we have to understand that these images of extreme deprivation probably do us an injustice in terms of understanding the nature of the challenge it presents at the current time. This is and again, I don't want to throw too many numbers at you. These are some data from the British Social Attitude Survey, the most recent ones from 2019, about concerns of levels of poverty in Britain. Scotland there sits towards the top of that list, and it's not necessarily a good thing, because the chart is ordered by the proportion of people in that part of the UK who are not very or not at all concerned with poverty. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. The data suggested then that 1 in 5 people in Scotland were either not very or not at all concerned with poverty. Now, of course, that means the vast majority were concerned, either fairly, 45%, or very concerned, 36%. But there is a significant proportion of people in Scotland that don't buy into this agenda, that hearts and minds still have to be won about what poverty is. And I think related to that, and this is a much more challenging set of data for us, we also ask people what's the main reason why they think poverty exists. And the most single common reason that's held by the main reason, remember, for why child poverty exists in the opinion of the people of Scotland is that parents suffer from alcohol, drug abuse or other addictions. 25% of Scots say that that's the main reason for poverty in Scotland. 15% say that the main reason for poverty in Scotland is inequalities in society. Interestingly, 9%, 1 in 10, say it's the parents' lack of education. Now, we could spend a lot of time working and making sense of these data, but the point I make is there are still a significant proportion of people in Scotland that are content to blame individuals for the circumstances in which they find themselves. Now, undoubtedly, alcoholism, drug abuse and addiction contributes towards poverty. It would be foolish to think otherwise. But to suggest that 25%, and if there are 1 million people in Scotland currently living an income that's too low, a poverty income, to suggest that 25% of them might be as a result of alcoholism, drug abuse and other addictions is to seriously misunderstand the nature of the problem. Now, I use the statistics rather glibly there, but it gives us a sense that, again, I don't think we fully understand the problem. Or indeed, if we are introducing anti-poverty interventions, we may be introducing these interventions with people who quite simply don't believe in what we are trying to do. And we can't assume that people think like us, act like us, and want what we want too. Again, this is the last set of numbers I'm going to throw at you, but it's a relative comparison that, in Scotland we are more atypical than typical in the rest of the UK in terms of the proportion of people that think that alcoholism, drug abuse and addictions are the main reason for poverty, comparable to the East Midlands, but much higher in Scotland than other parts of the UK. So there's something about how we make sense about poverty in Scotland that doesn't quite match what others think in the rest of the UK. And it's not necessarily more understanding. It's not necessarily more sympathetic. It's not necessarily an approach or a way of thinking that would lead us to look for structural interventions or policy solutions. It's maybe more likely for us to look at solutions that blame individuals and look at more stick than carrot approaches to tackling poverty. So how much is there in Scotland? Again, this bigger picture that I'm trying to paint so we can understand how education and educational psychology sits in this broader national agenda. Well, approaching a 250,000 children, with 2/3 of those children in a household with an adult, with at least one adult in at least some form of work. So working households are the most common form of household form that children in poverty experience in Scotland at the current time. This idea of the workless household is not a myth. but it's certainly one that doesn't quite represent the reality of family poverty in Scotland at the current time. And there's a good and a bad news story in this. The kind of bad news story is things haven't been moving in the right direction for a few years, but the good news story, if you look at these data, which is tracking rates of poverty through time, is that it can change, and it can change for the good. And for many years, rates of child poverty in Scotland, as with the rest of the UK, were reducing. And I think that's important to bear in mind, that if we choose to do certain things, if we choose certain policy interventions, then we can reduce the number of children living in poverty. It's not happening just now, but it is possible that we can make decisions that will have more progressive outcomes. And as I say, that idea of the working household is really quite a transition. It's something that's emerged very strongly post the austerity, the recession of 2008, that the increasing proportion of children living in poverty are living in a household where somebody works. And the point here is that work is not a simple solution to poverty. Work can be a solution to poverty if we configure work in a way that allows families to have a sufficient income and have access to sufficient work. But the reality at the current time is work is not working for too many families. Important to bear in mind in terms of when we configure these solutions. It's not an even problem across Scotland. If you are sitting just now in Glasgow, then you are more likely to understand it's much more prevalent than you are if you're sitting at the bottom of this chart in the Shetland Isles, or indeed in some areas on the edge of Glasgow, your East Renfrewshire and your Eastern Bartonshire, where it's much less prevalent. But although there's quite an unequal distribution of the risk of poverty across Scotland for children, I think an important point to acknowledge is that every single area within Scotland has a rate of poverty that's above our national target. In every single area, we've a distance to travel if we want to reduce poverty to the point at which we understand it to be eradicated in Scotland by 2030. So there is a request, if you like, that Shetland does its bit as much as Glasgow does its bit in tackling poverty in the years ahead. But these are the realities. This is what life is like in 2022 in Scotland. I don't need to spell it out to you. You're living it at the current time. We're talking about eradicating child poverty over the course of the next 8 years, but we're in the midst of something of a crisis. We certainly face a cost of living crisis, and there's absolutely no doubt that will impact the quality of lives as lived as we progress through the year. The fuel costs been exacerbated by the Ukraine context, and it's undoubtedly the case that there is going to be that squeeze on income as we progress. It doesn't look good for the remainder of 2022. And there are a whole set of other uncertainties that sit in the background as well. Our social security system is evolving. The Scottish layering of social security gives us a degree of flexibility to do more to protect our people in Scotland, and there are signs that that's beginning to be used. The local state is under stress with resources, but so much is asked of it in terms of delivery. There remain political uncertainties. The impact of Brexit is not clear. It might seem odd to say that, but we're still not clear exactly the longer term or even medium term impact that will have. And of course, we have the prospect of a referendum next year as well. So political matters are not resolved, as well as the wider global context. But the here and now in our face issues for too many people in Scotland are precarious work, that spectre of the cost of living crisis, and a reality right now of food and fuel insecurity. So not everyone in Scotland's in a good place at the current time, and it's important to acknowledge that. But what about education? Well, education is important to Scotland. I think it's part of how Scotland views itself. I mean, the lad of Perts, that kind of notion then of, in Scotland, if you have ability, then even if you don't have means, you will be able to succeed through education. It's certainly a trope, and something that, if we don't believe in it, it's something that's perpetuated and it's sold, if you like, to others about what we do within education. And we do have a sense of ourselves as being socially just, that what we want is to create a Scotland in which our vulnerable are protected, in which everyone can thrive. The reality, of course, as I've described already, is that we are far from there. But there's a constellation of factors, I think, that give us an opportunity. And I think we have to acknowledge that, and my strong personal opinion, is that if we don't grasp this opportunity right now, then I think we will lose an opportunity to really deal with these problems fundamentally. There's a constellation of things coming together, I think, that present a unique opportunity. It's indicated by the Scottish Attainment Challenge and the Child Poverty Delivery Plan. They're just, they're consequences, I think, of underlying drivers such as nationalist politics. Now, I'm not political, but I do think we have a sense just now in Scotland that we are trying to do something different from the rest of the UK. And at the current time, that something different is leading to a greater, stronger concern for social justice. I think on top of this, we've got a very strong anti-poverty sector in Scotland and are listened to within government. You know, the voice of lived experience is something that government are keen to listen to. And we've got local data that gives us a local intelligence so that we can properly monitor where we're at. So I think these constellation of factors coming together with these significant pieces of national legislation and policy and strategy means that, you know, over the course of the next couple of electoral cycles, we've a unique opportunity to make a difference. And I don't think that can go on forever. I think if we really fail to make progress in child poverty over the course of this decade, then I think that public will and indeed the political drive that underpins that will be lost. So I really do think it's a critical moment for us. And this is how we tend to view education as part of that critical moment, that it's a key point in the cycle. If someone is disadvantaged in education and skills, then it's more likely that their life and their family's life beyond them will be one in which they don't flourish, to use the words of the conference. It's a simple idea, but education is understood to have a critical role then in long-term approaches to tackling poverty. But rather than be a problem, of course, it can be the solution. That if we create, and I won't go into the detail of the chart here, but the short message of the image is that if you get education right, then it can start a virtuous cycle rather than a pernicious and negative cycle where people are able to achieve, able to overcome through education. Education having a critical role then in longer term strategies to tackle poverty in Scotland. But again, as you know, the reality is that it's not quite delivering at the current time. Now, these are slightly out-of-date data, but unfortunately still represent the picture. Giving back then National Performance Framework data, looking at key stages in curriculum for excellence and how well children are performing, from more deprived, the darker bars on the left, to the very least deprived, the middle colour on the right. And the reality, of course, as we probably would expect, regrettably, is that kids from the more affluent backgrounds or the least deprived backgrounds are more likely to performing well in school. That's one story in this. The bars always rise up from left to right as we move from most deprived to least deprived. But another story in these charts is that there seems to be a drop-off in many of these factors in S2 in the more deprived areas. So we're needing not just early intervention in education, but sustained intervention and age-appropriate intervention to enable children to achieve. If we just look at these data for writing then, 54% of kids in the most deprived area in primary 4 are achieving the level expected of them. It remains fairly stable, so no progress. Still about 52% of children from the most deprived areas in P7, but into S2 has dropped down to 40%. So that's suggesting then that it's not just about early intervention, but it's about early and sustained intervention with age-appropriate interventions in education. Same applies here for listening and talking. PEF for rich kids, yeah, well, I mean, I'm a firm believer in the value of pupil equity fund if we can get it right. But PEF is not always used right and appropriately. My daughter benefited from PEF money. I'd mentioned earlier on that my daughter then is, or our family live in one of Scotland's 10% most deprived areas, and technically speaking then are one of the groups that might be targeted and might be thought to be useful then for directing resources in terms of PEF. My daughter didn't excel in mathematics in primary school. She struggled to grasp the concepts. She's doing much better now at secondary school. I think the time is right for her to deal with these concepts. But she was a significant beneficiary of some extra resource that came into the school through PEF in primary school. And the school were very comfortable at directing the resources because they felt they could get a return with more than they felt she had potential with this extra resource for her to make an improvement that otherwise might not have been able. A good use of PEF in some respects, that extra resource, able to do more and to tailor it to the needs of an individual child. But we might argue whether or not my daughter was the type of daughter that should have been funded with that money. I think PEF has to work harder. I think we have to be smarter with it going ahead. And I know there are issues to do with transparency. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to pinpoint people, kids that are getting PEF money. But I do think we need to be smarter about making sure that that money does exactly what it's meant to do. And that's work towards narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap. So what about education and anti-poverty strategy? Well, as I said yesterday, Bright Start, Bright Futures was released, the second child poverty delivery plan. I'm digesting that just now. I read some of it yesterday and we'll finish it off today. The first delivery plan, though, had a role for education, but quite an interesting one, I think, for us to make sense of. But it's not just these national plans, we've also got the local plans, and I would implore every one of us, the over 200 of us in the call today, and perhaps the many more that listen in later, to be looking at what our local Child Poverty Action Report is planning to do to use local resources to tackle poverty, and specifically to think about how education is configured within these plans. Now, I've mentioned the long-term impact of education and what it can have in tackling poverty, but the targets that we have for the child poverty under the 2017 Act are defined in terms of income. They don't lend themselves particularly well to educational interventions. To go back to the King Kong versus Godzilla image earlier on, we need to think about how these two giants can cuddle each other and align themselves rather than, if you like, pursue separate agendas. And I think the Scottish Government are certainly getting that. There's signs of much more closer working between the directorates that are responsible for these plans than perhaps there was over the last few years, and understanding they have to work better together. And I think, to go back to Bright Start, Bright Futures, there's a different tone, I think, in that document about the role of education in that broader agenda compared to what there was first time around. But education did feature first time around, and this is a driver diagram. This is the local actions that we want to use then to tackle poverty. Education's hinted at in some of these and actually makes a significant contribution to many. Significantly in terms of cost of living, the things that we can do in education to reduce the cost of living, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail, is something that was explicitly acknowledged first time around. But also wraparound childcare, which I think is now going to be much more important as we move ahead in the second delivery plan. And the obvious, or one of the obvious locations for that wraparound childcare is the school. And I think, again, the possibility of the school featuring more prominently in that broader quest than that perhaps there was first time around. And of course, in terms of labour market and skills, this idea of enabling children to achieve through school in order to gain more returns and have a richer working life beyond school. Not an immediate impact on poverty numbers, but a long-term significant driver to reduce the problems of poverty. So in many ways, either direct in the here and now, but also maybe long-term and foundational, education's got a role to play in this broader agenda. If you like, it's a very important cog in that wheel that is tackling child poverty. Some groups are acknowledged to be at greater risk than others. These may be populations that don't surprise us, lone parents, minority ethnic groups, disabled children, large families. These groups tend to be groups we understand are more likely to live in households with higher levels of poverty. But I think interestingly as well, young mothers, the youngest aged under one, if there's a child under one in the household, so that might be a kid who's a 6-year-old, but is a child aged under one, a sibling aged under one, then that child, 6-year-old, is part of a group that's more likely to be at risk of poverty too. And linked in with that, young mothers, much higher risk of poverty amongst these groups. So in families with very young children, even though those young children are not at school, they're a high risk group for poverty. And young mothers, where the mother is aged under 25, is another group with significant levels of poverty amongst that population. And here's an example from the first delivery plan, not from the second refreshed one, but the first one about how school featured. The cost of the school day was something that very much was in focus first time around, in which significant numbers of local authorities in Scotland had as part of their local child poverty action reports. What can be done in school to reduce the hidden costs of a school day? School is maybe free in the sense that we don't pay for that education, but school is not free in the sense that there are many hidden costs that are associated with that education. School meals is another element, and I'd mentioned, or rather it was mentioned by way of introduction, the other work that I've done recently, canvassing the opinion of 17,000 secondary school kids and school meals. I think that's a broader bit of work that's also relevant to this agenda too. And school meals and school clothing grant were mentioned as part of factors then that would be monitored first time around, and I say I've not quite completely digested the second plan, but I would guess that, and it seems to me by an early reading, that education features even more strongly than it did first time around. But not quite the elephant in the room. We had COVID in the last few years. With COVID, of course, we've got the cost of living crisis ahead, but there was certainly a sense in which progress that might have been made was hampered over the COVID years. And canvassing of parents suggested that many kids were struggling with their education and were struggling for a range of reasons. In some cases, lack of motivation as much indeed as lack of resources, such as devices or appropriate resources for education. For many kids, not having access to resources was a problem. But for more kids, parents were reporting that they simply seemed to lack motivation in their studies, which I'm sure is something that we are keenly aware of as we try and reinvigorate the educational environment of children, return to school in greater numbers. Not quite yet, but certainly as we move ahead at the remainder of the year. But there are other significant things happened as well. I think celebrity began to get involved. The Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United player, strongly protesting at the insensitivity of the UK government and its lack of commitment to support families over the summer period with school meals. Leading to 2 U-turns over the course of the COVID period by the UK government. Didn't lead to a U-turn in Scotland, because Scotland was already committed to this agenda about looking at ways to support children in low-income families over the holiday periods. But it gave us a sense in which people were fed up. They were not prepared to accept these injustices and were looking for new solutions. And in a very different domain, these new solutions are also sought by young people too. Now, of course, here we're talking about environment, and Greta Thunberg, not just the only young person, but certainly somebody who captured the imagination of many young people as well as political leaders over the last few years, not in the COVID period, but pre-COVID, in terms of getting us to rethink the environment. So I think there's a sea of changes possibly out there that young people can be an engine for change, and certainly some of the work that I'm involved in about school meals and cost of the school day, it demonstrates a degree of sensitivity amongst young people to the challenges it present in schools, and a sense of wanting something to be done, and not always for themselves, but sometimes for their friends, sometimes for the broader school community. I think I'd mentioned we're in a significant political moment, but I also think we're in a different moment in terms of what people want to happen and their ability to have their voices heard. I'm moving towards the end and hopefully get some time for questions. We're committed then to reduce the number of people in Scotland that are living in poverty. The 2017 Act wants us to eradicate child poverty by 2030. But that reducing the number of people living in poverty is not the best goal for education in the here and now. There are so many other things that educational psychologists and other practitioners in education are doing to make the lives of children living in poverty less negative at the current time, and it's important that we acknowledge that that's part of the quest to tackle poverty in the here and now. It's not just about reducing the numbers, it's about making a good life at the current time, here in the now. That's protecting people from the worst excesses of poverty. It's enabling them to increase their chances of living a poverty-free life. These, I think, are really important in terms of education, giving children the tools to succeed as they move beyond childhood, and protecting children at the current time by ensuring that our schools are not making life worse for children or heightening inequalities that already exist. These actions won't reduce poverty in the here and now, but are critically important in terms of laying the foundations for a just society, and I think also tackling poverty in the longer term. So I think we have to conceptualise our work in education in a slightly different way and perhaps recalibrate what we're targeting, because this schematic then says that a different way of understanding what poverty is leads us to focus on different groups. And we are the focus in protecting from the worst excesses of poverty needs a sensitivity to those in our school communities who are the very most vulnerable, and that can be lost if we're primarily concerned with reducing the number of people living in poverty, which is often targeted at those that are just in the margins. And I think it's really important that we've got a clear sense of purpose about what it is we're trying to achieve, not just in education, but anywhere, but thinking about education, what it is we're trying to achieve through our anti-poverty interventions. So just by way of conclusion, and I very much hope I've left time for some dialogue, but what I want to end up with is some thoughts on poverty-proofing schools, which I think is vitally important work and is going on in lots of ways. I think we should shout loud. By that I mean a race to the top. Now, I don't know how far Glasgow has progressed with this, I must confess, but the Glasgow did commit to give every child from P6 and upwards access to a free tablet device. And that's the kind of thing that I'd like, other authorities to almost feel embarrassed about and want to do something about, and to pull themselves up to the high standards that are set by some authorities. If one authority has found the money then to provide a provision that's going to transform young people's lives, why can't that be those monies be found in other areas? Now, of course, different areas have different challenges, and we fully understand that to be the point, and we know that there is stress on money, but I think we should not be shy at shouting when we're doing something well, because when we're shouting and doing something well, I think it gives others the opportunity to argue the case for something similar in their areas as well. So I think shouting loud and starting a race to the top, I think, is really important. But at the same time, schools are doing many things to tackle poverty by stealth. School uniform banks are becoming increasingly more common. It can be packaged not just as a uniform bank, which might be taken slightly more regressively, or there might be a greater concern in terms of sensitivity and that idea of standing out from the crowd by using a uniform bank. But when we present it in the form of recycling, we reuse, relove and recycle our stuff, then we certainly have a certain different tone to what's essentially the same outcome. It's about getting kit to those that need it. There is much cost of the school day work that's out there, and I think I was in a talk earlier this week with the cost of the rural school day up with the Northern Alliance, and there were really some quite outstanding examples. There was one school in particular that was just a battery of excellent ideas to reduce the cost of the school day. Subtle ways that, we're just making the ability of low-income families, their lives in school, that little bit more tolerable than otherwise might be the case. Poverty-proofing fundraising, I think, is a simple thing that needs to be done. I think schools are fantastic at engaging with wider agendas, but inadvertently sometimes that asking for money is a problem. And I think there are subtle ways in which we can engage with these debates and can contribute to these wider societal goals without drawing any attention to the fact that not all families are able to contribute. Sometimes just, I think, again, to steal an example from earlier in the week, raising awareness of the worthy cause rather than asking children to contribute to the worthy cause is a good contribution to make in the first instance, or making contributions voluntary rather than compulsory when it comes to, dress down Fridays, for example. These are small things, but a small amount of money for a middle income professional can actually be quite a significant sum of money for a low income family. And I think we need to be sensitive to these things. Free school meals still need to be fixed. It's a bigger problem. The rates of school meal uptake are not what they should be, and I think there's a real significant debate to be had about what we can do to make free school meals do what they're meant to do, which is to reduce the pounds and pence in a family budget over the course of the year. To stretch the pounds and pence by reducing family outcome, and it's not the case for too many families. In the Scottish Attainment Challenge, I think there's a broader view of what success is. It's not just about attainment. I think that broader sense of achievement will be something that will be stronger in SAC 2, second time around. And I think that's important that we're aware of that too. Pupil Equity Fund, I think, has got to work better. I think we really have to make those pounds and pence do what they're meant to do, and that's work towards narrowing poverty-related attainment. I think anybody, and I don't just mean educational psychologists, I mean anybody has got to think about how their work, whatever that work happens to be, feeds into that local action to tackle child poverty. And we should all be aware of that local report and ensure that our work is represented within that. We have to acknowledge that our school priorities are different. There are over 250, 300 secondary schools, a couple of thousand primary schools in Scotland. It won't be the same challenge for all. But I think ultimately all these other things are important. I think they do make life more tolerable for families, but we can't shirk the fact that we have to narrow those attainment gaps, which are far too great at the current time. So I hope I've very much delivered what you were looking for, which is to enable you to think through how educational psychology is just one of the important cogs in that broader wheel of tackling poverty in Scotland. And I very much hope that I've left some time to engage in debate and questions as well. But thank you very much for sparing me the time this morning to listen to me.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, you have left enough time for questions. There's some questions in the chat pane, and then we've got some people with hands up. So I think the chat pane question, in fact, before I go on, Alison Crawford's the principal psychologist out in Glasgow, and she said the rollout of iPads is complete as far as she's aware, and the work from children and young people is amazing. So there you go, there's an update for your slides for next time.
Excellent, thank you.
There was Mrs. Miller. Do you want to come in and talk about PEF? You've got a question in the chat pane there.
Hi, morning everyone. We're in the southwest of Greenock, John, and I've been head for 7 years, deputy for 2 years, but I've taught, this is 30 years in Larkfield, so I know it inside out. We absolutely were a poster child for PEF prior to COVID. You know, we've got play therapy, we work with our Bernardo's worker that's SAC funded. We had increased attainment in literacy from, at first level, from 17%, which, you know, I'm not proud to say out loud in front of all these people, to 68% over the course of the first few years of PEF, massively reduced children's mental health problems. You know, we've got Liam running. We had all of these things. We were absolutely flourishing, and the COVID absolutely devastated us. Our families didn't engage. They just didn't engage. And in the first lockdown, they didn't have the devices, but even with the devices, they used them to game. You know, they just didn't engage. And we faced a significant drop, average of 40% across all the criteria and the stages, which was pretty devastating for all the staff who are incredibly committed. But we've been working our socks off and trying to get it back and being really innovative. You know, we've got outdoor nurture groups, we've got all this thing going on. But in the loss of the 15% uplift that we got for COVID, so that's gone. And in the change of the metric, so I said that it was a £17,000 drop. It's actually over £30,000 this year we're facing. And, you know, the Scottish Government are constantly saying, how are you making this sustainable? It absolutely is not sustainable. And I think people need to stop being coy about that. We cannot, all my interventions involved human beings. We didn't buy resources. They all involved human beings. You cannot have them if you don't have the cash to do it. And that change in the metric has really penalised my families who, for loads of reasons, don't apply for free school meals. The children won't eat them. Yeah. All these kinds of things, and that's where we're left now, and it's actually feeling increasingly concerning. How are we going to continue to do what we've been doing? And I don't see how we do.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Mrs. Miller, I was just sort of thinking your question there was about that metric type thing in the chat pane. So it was, which metric would, John, would you think you would apply to allocate PEF? Is there anything different that you're sort of thinking about that would be helpful?
Yeah,
because obviously there is a sort of pot of money there that is not doesn't come from a tree. It's not infinite.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why free school meals is used, but the problem is that it's picked up by Mrs. Miller there that free school meals isn't used in the way that we want by parents for a variety of reasons that not all register for free school meals. It's also perceived to be a bigger issue in rural areas, you know, whether it is or not, because obviously you're dealing in an urban area in Greenock, but it's also perceived in rural areas that parents and families are less likely to present for any benefit, and therefore the metric that you're used to allocate that money suggests that the level of need is not quite where it's at. Well, I think one of the solutions is to get free school meals to work better. You know, if free school meals would work better, there wouldn't be a reticence to register for it. And these issues are all interconnected. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that's a longer term issue and it's a bigger problem, but if free school meals was able to do what it's meant to do, then it would be a very sensible metric to use in terms of allocating money for PEF, because it is, of course, a passported benefit. It's given to people who the country agrees then should get a little bit extra support by a free school meal for their children. The problem is the registration bit that comes with it rather than the actual allocation of need. I think there are other things we could do, but you know, the information we have locally on need and entitlement to benefits doesn't stop with free school meals. So there are probably other things that we could do to be a little bit cleverer with that metric, where there is an obvious mismatch between the need in the area and the registration for free school meals, therefore that impairs or reduces the amount of money that goes to the school. So two answers to the question. One is free school meals has got to work better, and then it becomes a simpler metric. But I think that if it's clearly failing in some areas, I think there are other things we can do, because we have data and we have the intelligence of working with that local data to make sure resource goes where it's needed.
Thanks so much, John. Right. I'm just moving on to the next question, if that's okay, Mrs. Miller. We've got Sharon. Sharon Harper, how are you? Would you like to come in? You've got your hand up.
Apologies, Jackie, that was an error. I'm really sorry. Apologies. Really enjoying the discussion, though. Really enjoying the discussion. It's very...
Thank you. No worries, Sharon. I suppose one of the things that I'm seeing in the chat pane, which I think would be really, really interesting, because there's some chat around sort of universal versus targeted, because you were saying something there, John, about sort of the targeted approach to PEF, and then Marielle, you wrote something about how you were wanting to, try to scroll back up and it's not letting me, sometimes a more universal approach is needed to take a non-stigmatised approach. So I suppose I was just sort of thinking, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real issue. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if I think on the margins, I don't think it matters. You know, if you're in a school, perhaps like, you know, the one that Mrs. Miller's referring to in Greenock, where the majority of kids that are in low income, and you might get one or two kids that aren't, it doesn't matter as much that all kids have access to it. It matters a lot if it's flip side. You know, it matters a lot if you're given universal provision and it's a smaller amount of kids, and therefore that resource is inevitably being stretched. So I think you need a little bit of local discretion. You need head teachers that get, or others in schools that are administering the resources, to understand the agenda and then have the flexibility to use the resources as they see fit. But I think we still have to hold, you know, we have to be clear about what's not acceptable spend. And to be fair, I think first time around, PEF came quickly. You know, maybe when it came in, not everybody was exactly sure how these resources were going to be used. We're 4 years further on now. You know, we're not at that place now. We know what works with PEF. We know what could work. There's much good evidence there. And, you know, Patricia's just put up a post there about new resources yesterday, but examples of how PEF are used across Scotland in the chat. You know, there's no excuse for us not making PEF work better now. But I do think you don't need, we can't be cack-handed. You know, we can't have overly narrow requirements about how PEF should be used. We've got to have some local discretion, but we've got to get teachers that understand what PEF is trying to do, and therefore they use that discretion to achieve that. And if that means that we, in some schools, it's not, or it's used in a way where entitlement is not narrowly going to the kids that it's targeted for, because it's understood that everybody will benefit, then that's a sensible solution in that school.
Yeah, I think school, it's certainly in my work, with schools and working alongside schools, that contextual analysis around where we can actually make the difference, but also what's not just from the data, not just from sort of ASIL data or insight data, but also that community intelligence as well. Where are the strengths and where are the assets in the community too? Like, it can't just be deficit led, I think.
You know, I couldn't agree more. You know, two things you've said there. You know, one, the community as a resource. Absolutely, the community is a resource that can be used, but it's also about the professionals within the school. I mean, some of the most inspiring anti-poverty actors are head teachers and those within schools. You know, the teachers that have got that stash of food and have had that stash of food for many years because incidentally they're feeding their kids. This is anti-poverty action. And that's understanding the people you work with and doing whatever you can to make a difference. Now, it shouldn't be that way, and we know it shouldn't be that way, but there is so much commitment amongst head teachers. There's so much, and I've seen it in a few stellar head teachers in very different parts of the country, you know, in Inverness and Glasgow, just two things that I can think of right away in two primary schools that are just doing so many different things in their school to tackle these problems because they understand what's going on, but they also understand that community can be a resource as well. And it's not just about, you know, education and educational professionals delivering what's required, but pulling in those within that community that can make a difference too.
Definitely. In the chat pane, John, we've got Dr. Ross. He's sort of, we need to consider the transgenerational issues. Dr. Ross, do you want to come in and say a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, working within the schools, obviously the child planning meetings, and one of the difficulties that we often find is engaging parents in the supports for children. Schools are putting in lots of really good supports for their pupils, but if parents have had a kind of negative experience in school, it can often be really difficult to try and engage them as well in supporting their children appropriately, so you can kind of get caught in that it's kind of negative loop almost. So it's just about trying to think of ways of being able to encourage parents to kind of get on board in terms of supporting and to give them that kind of positive outlook on how important education is for their children as well.
Sure, you can't force somebody to do something they don't want to do, but what you absolutely can do is you can make sure that any barriers that might be there are removed. So let me give you a concrete example. You have a Burns night and you invite the families to come in and celebrate Burns night in the school. You know, I'm thinking of a concrete example at the back of my mind here. But when you do that, then if you're requiring that families to come along and bring money in order to participate, if you've got a raffle that's going to cost a couple of quid, if you're selling juice that's going to cost and you've got Chris that are bought as well, then that is an obvious disadvantage to families that financially can't afford that. So that's a subtle way in which you're saying this school isn't open to you. This school is not given every opportunity for your kid to participate. So I think we really need to get down to that level and understand, and many teachers do, but I guess that some perhaps don't or understand the intensity of the problems they're experienced, and perhaps I'm sure inadvertently are making that school a slightly less welcoming place for parents. So you can't force a parent to, throw 100% of their time and energy into education, but what you can do is you can, in any way, shape or form, make it a more welcoming environment that makes it seem as if this is an environment in which you are welcomed. And of course, there are other examples about involving parents in schools education more directly and pulling in kids, parents with literacy issues and trying to get them to enable them to support their kids in the learning, which many parents want to do, but just simply don't have the means to do it. So I think there are different things to do there. One is there anything that can be done directly with the parents to enable them to engage more in the learning? And two is, what can we as a school community do to make sure that we're not inadvertently sending out the wrong message to parents that this isn't a place for you and we're excluding on grounds of cost?
People are beginning to get into their flow here, John. We've got a few questions coming in the chat pane. So we've got Kirsty there. Kirsty, you're saying something about, do you want to come in and ask a question around there about the dialogue?
Hi, yeah, I suppose I don't want to kind of go back to PEF and make us focus on it all of the time. However, it has been a frustrating topic for all of us as educational psychologists. It's something we've discussed a lot in terms of the planning and implementation of PEF, and I think given that we're at an EP conference, it's really important to bring that in. We've had a lot of discussion from the very outset about actually implementation science. As educational psychologists, we're always looking outwards. We're looking at structural inequality. We're adopting an ecological model and thinking, okay, to have the most impact and the best outcomes, how can we look more widely, and whatever schools are going to do, how is that going to be evaluated and have the best outcome for those young people, whether that's a universal level or across the board, depending upon the needs of those children in that school. And I know with the SAC being relaunched, there is that kind of strengthening between partnerships. I think that's really important going forward when we're looking at PEF going forward. How can we work together to ensure that we're tackling things at a broader level and that we're really using implementation science and using the research methods that we use as a profession to evaluate that? So just really, that was my comment rather than a question, but I don't know, John, if you've got anything you want to say in response to that. Just
evaluation is important. I mean, there's nothing wrong with something not working. If you use that kind of, I'm stealing a line from Harry Burns, but if you do the things that you've done in the past, then you're going to get the same results that you've got in the past. You've got to try something different, but you also have to evaluate it properly to make sure that that's delivering the return that you want. And if something doesn't work, then what you've got to be able to do is have the evidence that allows you to pull back and say, right, that's not working. We need to use that resources in a different way. So I'm absolutely all for evaluation. Now, I might see that as a researcher. That's my job.
Yeah, I think as well, it's the needs analysis before the evaluation. It's us working together collaboratively to identify what are the needs here for this particular population we're working with, to then identify what we put in place and then implement. So I think that for me is the big thing to think on and for us to do collectively as well as part of the refreshed SAC.
I kind of almost, drop of the shoulders to hear that hasn't happened, because to me that's the first thing that should happen. You know, if you've got that extra resource, then surely you've got to look at what the need is before you make the decisions and what's to be spent.
Yeah. So bringing, so if we're doing that together, then hopefully going forward that is something positive if we can have a key role and work together to do that.
Yep. And showcase. I mean, the other thing, Kirsty, as well, we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time with evidence. I mean, I think, you know, the point that Patricia Watson's put up there about some examples of PEF that's working. You know, we've already had some evaluation and tests have changed that are showing that some things are working in different places. We've just got to be aware of that. You know, that and that type of intervention might be something that you can apply locally, and it's proven to work, and it's exactly what you're looking for. So we've got to have an effective way of sharing practice as well. We don't need to keep reinventing the wheel, but we certainly have to evaluate. It has to be needs-based and has to be evaluated to make sure that it's impactful.
Patricia, do you want to come in? I was just thinking myself there as well about the PEF, some of the comments you were making about PEF and the sort of resource that's just coming out. Maybe not.
Sorry. I'm saying that the resource itself, I'm sure people will pick up. We just published it yesterday, so we'll make sure that it's continually reinforced, of course, in the communications and so on, so that people get an awareness of that, because I think it is quite a unique resource in that it really highlights very specific examples, tells you exactly who's doing what, so that we can start to network and make connections. It's not a generic Education Scotland publication that's high level. It's absolutely about this is what happens in that school, this school, and those people are named, and we're, you know, using that as a way of hopefully connecting people. But I do think it's what the resource does is brings us back as well to the national guidance around PEF and the kind of key aspirations for that fund. And I think that was my point around kind of universal and targeted. I think John's point is right. If we're in areas of very high levels of deprivation and we're just talking about one or two or a small proportion of other pupils that are benefiting from a universal intervention, that's absolutely right, and no issues with that. But we do know that there are schools and areas where PEF has been underspent in recent years, and so we're really encouraging Woking to work with their attainment advisors and their local authorities to let's see if we can actually make the maximum potential from this money going forward, and make sure that it is making a difference to those young people that it's meant for, because we can't, it's almost shameful, isn't it? And we know there's lots of reasons for it, but to say we've got money that's been allocated to address some of the poverty issues in schools, and then to be able to say at the end of a year, oh, and look at all these underspends, that if there are reasons for that and we can help support, and the attainment advisors can help to get schools to get underneath the skin of why or where, or if we can connect people up and do more partnership working that's benefiting that, you know, the young people that money is intended for, let's do that. Let's get in and about it and see what we can all do to make sure that money is, every single penny of it is spent in the coming years.
I'm just thinking there's perhaps time for one last question before we're going to a break. P. McGill, I hate saying that, but it just says, P. McGill, the concept of proportional universalism is helpful. I don't know if you want to come in and say a wee bit more about that, because I think that's quite, I saw some chat after that.
Hi there. Yeah, it's just something I've come across that's when I've been doing some reading around tackling poverty from the health sector. So I think in health, that approach is used where there is poverty-related health gaps, and there's an area of deprivation, but there might be other areas around it where there's greater affluence, but something might be established there that, you know, the whole community from that area or region can access.
Yep.
So I just think it's, you know, when we're talking about, you know, concerns about, you know, kind of selecting pupils in schools and stigmatisation and all the rest of it, and talking about the cost of school day and free school meals and so on, if you make things universal, then you'll just get the greatest gains for those in most need. You know, it's actually quite a simple concept. So I feel quite comfortable in terms of interventions that are universal. They're just for everyone, and there's no stigmatisation, but we know there'll be a gain for those that we are actually targeting, but we're doing it. I think John earlier used the term by stealth, you know, so addressing poverty by stealth.
It's a big argument. It's a big issue. I mean, that idea that universal provision actually can be cost effective as well, because you reduce administrative costs in some cases. But we have to say in some cases, the idea of universal basic services is something I think we have to think very carefully about. I think used in the right way, and I think the point. Sorry, what does a P stand for? Is it Paul, Peter?
Oh, sorry, it's Paul. Sorry, I meant to introduce myself.
Sorry, Paul. So the point that Paul makes in the comment was that, in some cases, I think proportionate universalism can be helpful. So what we have to do is identify what those some cases are. It won't work for everything because we don't have the money to make absolutely everything universal. But where it is working, then we have to make sure that we invest in that properly. Now, we kind of think that the free school meals in primary schools is going to achieve that, and that's why we went free school meals in P1 to P7. Breakfast food's another one that's been introduced. Now, I've spent the last couple of days up at a school in Highland who are already introducing, just now piloting universal breakfast provision. The way they're doing it, to me, is really interesting. It's not just about food, it's about a nurturing start to the school day. It's about a soft start to the school where, they just bed people in and the food's almost incidental, but it is provided there. Now, that to me is an interesting example, because it's not just about the food, it's about it's a culture that's created around about the food. So it's not just the provision. I think it's the way that universal provision is introduced is equally important. But I think we do have to understand, or we have to ascertain which one of these universal provisions has actually got that bigger impact, what proportionate universalism is required for us to function effectively as a society. We're not quite there yet, I don't think, but certainly, Paul, I think it's something that we have to better understand.
No, thank you so much. I'm just aware of time, guys, that we are going into a break shortly. So I think just really there's some further information in the chat pane about after the conversation with Kirsty about making sure that as Ed Sykes, keeping on working with colleagues so they understand how we can help with some of that contextual analysis, the evidence, the evaluating, the measuring. That is a really important role for Ed Sykes within this in education. So, John, I would just like to take the opportunity to thank you so much for coming along today and giving us such a thought-provoking and insightful keynote about poverty. Certainly, I've heard you speak before, and you did not disappoint at all, but also know that you were updating your slides as of yesterday so that they included the Best Start Bright Futures information. So thanks so much for taking the time to do that. You really made me think about, in The Psychologist, I think it was last year, there was a cover, and it was about From Poverty to Flourishing, but one of the articles in it was you can improve the policy by attending to people's dignity. And I think that was really, it really made me think, but it also, what you were talking about today really resonated with what that article was saying as well. We do need to think about people and making sure we're framing our language in the right way. So thank you so much.
Not at all. Can I just say, Jackie, I can't stay for the rest of the conference. I do apologise for that. I've got coursework submissions today, and I know that my inbox is going to be mad full of students with last minute panic, so I'm going to have to deal with that. But I'm so glad to be invited along. I'm happy to share those slides. I think they will be after it. And if anybody needs to get in touch, feel free to do so afterwards. Very happy to do that. And best of luck with the rest of your conference. Sounds fantastic.
Thank you, John.